So I think we've spoken a lot about the political side of things, but there are an awful lot of G.K. Chesterton quotes that I find myself liking a great deal. And at the front of the book, there are four quotes, and one of them is by G.K. Chesterton. And I think it is a very powerful one, and it's also quite kind of dear to my heart, but not something that is really embraced very much. I suppose people think it's a nice idea, but political types don't tend to worry about this. And the quote is, "All real democracy is an attempt to bring the shy people out." And I love that because I just see such a bias in electoral politics towards the highly educated, the wealthy, the self-assertive, the narcissistic, the Machiavellian, the psychopath. Not all politicians are psychopaths, but maybe 1% of the population are psychopaths and maybe 4% of politicians are psychopaths. That's a nasty bit of bias that we've got in the system. So I was really quite struck with your father's using that quote, but obviously taking it very much to heart. I'll get the quote because I've just brought it. I've just brought up the. But he talks about. Or perhaps I'll invite you to comment on. No, I should be able to find it quickly enough. Just hang on.
The interesting thing about that quote by G.K. Chesterton, Nicholas, is that the full quote, which I hadn't realised, but Helen Landemore, the professor at Yale, who
oh yes, I think I've seen it. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, she found that the full quote is that the democracy should be like a jolly hostess bringing the shy people out, and that is also has two concepts in it, the jolly hostess, that I think are really relevant to the citizens' assembly method. One is jolly. It is a joyous thing. It is amazing, as you were mentioning from that documentary in the United States.
Yeah.
People are really so moved by their experience of actually participating.
Yes.
This Paris Convention, people were standing up and saying that they were these 27 days that they had spent together over 9 weekends had been the best time of their life, which is quite amazing. And I could see why as well, because they'd really been taken seriously in a way perhaps they hadn't before. But also the hostess side of it. It can't happen on its own. It has to be formed and guided and helped. It doesn't happen on its own. It's not like being, you're being asked to solve euthanasia. It's not like being a reporter going around to interview everyone and you know what you're doing. Everyone has to be brought to you. There has a whole process that has to happen for the best result to come out. So G.K. Chesterton was perhaps wiser than he knew.
Well, yes, and G.K. Chesterton's hostess, he's writing early in the 20th century where people are not going to be timid as we are today about talking about the masculine and the feminine. But it seems to me that in terms of stereotypes, our democracy is very masculine, and it is significant that it is the jolly hostess. This is the role of knitting people together in order to explore their differences, rather than highlighting their differences in order for them to compete and to log roll their way towards a 51% majority. It's hard to imagine.
I think you're absolutely right on the masculine side of it. My wife has just written a book called The We Mind versus the Me Mind, and trying to not allocate gender and psychology, but absolutely the way that the hierarchical, narcissistic nature of politics is absolutely me-minded. And the hostess side is definitely we-minded. And we need a whole lot more we-mindedness in our world.
Yeah. And so in Australia, I regard Australia at the moment, I was quite thrilled. I've been thrilled twice in the last year, I suppose. Well, it's slightly more than a year. You might have been thrilled with the first event, which was on the invasion of Ukraine. Zelensky doing a Churchill and just saying, well, you can come and kill me if you can, but I'm sticking around. I don't need a ride. I need ammo. And all of a sudden, I mean, what I found so moving about that, apart from the fact that it's just moving to watch someone who believes in something and is prepared to die for it, that there's something, what's happening there is a person is actually inhabiting their role. And most of the time we just have people playing the role. certainly most of the talking heads on TV will move on. If they're politicians and there's an election and they move from opposition to government or vice versa, they will be arguing the exact opposite of what they've been arguing in front of your eyes. If they're a representative of the oil industry or the renewables industry, they don't act. They might believe their case, but they probably don't believe it so much. Within reason. So we have a play-acting society. Now, that was the first exciting thing. Now, the second exciting thing was the most recent election in Australia, because what happened was that our Conservatives, who are called the Liberal Party here, because of course that's one of the purposes when you name an organisation in politics, you're certainly trying to cover your tracks. And our Liberal Party, our Conservatives, are clearly, some of them rather like Donald Trump, and they've been, and a good chunk of them are channeling the US Republicans. And a group of people, and what happened is that starting in, I think, 2013, a while now ago, a particularly bad Liberal Party candidate in a regional seat was unseated by an independent. And it was a community movement. And this then, in the last election, about 8 new people like that were elected, and they basically stole the crown jewels from the the Australian Conservative political party, all the richest seats, basically. Now, almost all of them were women, and they had a particular methodology which came from the Victorian Women's Trust, and it was called the kitchen table methodology, kitchen table conversation methodology. And that's a feminine thing, a kitchen table conversation. And what people found is that the men liked pontificating, as you and I are doing right now, Hugh, and the women would often be the ones who would take them, quite consistently, that if you asked who was taking the notes and who was doing the behind the scenes work, it was preponderantly women. So these candidates, they're called the teal candidates, a mix of blue to represent the Conservatives and green to represent their environmentally aware politics. They are almost all of them very articulate, very well educated, and very accomplished women. All of those things weren't so unusual in politics when I was a kid. The women was, but the idea that plenty of MPs were independently accomplished before they turned up in Parliament, well, that's kind of gone as well. So this is a tremendous, insofar as it can happen in a toxic system, this has tremendously revived it, I think. And I just wanted to throw in that element that it has revived it through the feminine, if I can use that simple word. It has infused Australian politics with feminine virtues. And you can decide, you can believe those things are culturally feminine, biologically feminine, or not feminine at all, nothing to do with women at all. You know what types of things I'm talking about, which is knitting people together, not thinking that the most important thing is to display your power and strength and so on and so forth. And
I think,
you go.
I think that the word "we-minded" really encapsulates what you want. So I will definitely be sending you a link to my wife Jessica Lutz's book. But I think, as you remark, I mean, luckily human beings, even within the electoral system, are innovate. We are innovators, and
yes. Well, it's still an open system. That's the great thing. It's still an open system, and it can fall prey to well-organised people who have a clear idea of what they want to do and can communicate it. And people will say, as I'm fond of saying, in the words of the scene from When Harry Met Sally, I'll have what she's having. I don't know whether you know what that is a reference to, but anyway, go on.
No idea, but
okay.
Sure
well, some people will.
Resonating with the audience, but no, I think that you're right. It is an open system, and what's also very encouraging is that the kind of experimentation which we need to set up some new ways of taking decisions and to improve on the current procedures that we have, they are being backed by some governments. And look at France. President Macron is actively helping sortition make its mark. Yeah. And in Belgium, where I live, that
Oh, well,
this
yeah.
weekend there are four citizens' assemblies this weekend, and some of them have been integrated into the parliamentary system into the election-based parliamentary system in a very interesting way. There, the president of the French-speaking parliament of the Brussels region, I won't go into the complications of our dozen or more governments in Belgium, but she has decided that in order for politicians to recover the link that they should have with their electors and with the people, because the problem in Belgium is that people, even though they're legally obliged to vote, they're often voting blanks. And, politicians are people, they want to be appreciated. And this idea that the people is turning against them, she has introduced this idea that in the parliamentary committees, they will bring in 3/4 of the participants as randomly selected citizens and 1/4 as parliamentarians. And in this way, she hopes that not only will politics seem closer to people, but also they will reintroduce the idea of debate. Because, yes, the on the continent there are lots of parties, but that's partly because there's a lot of proportional representation in European systems. And what happens with proportional representation, of course, is you get lots and lots of different parties. And therefore you have coalition agreements, but this hands all the power to the party elites. And as we know, parties are only 3% of the population max. And the people who run parties are maybe 3% of that 3%. And what the president of the parliament in Brussels thought was that, no longer are we discussing what we are legislating on the parliamentary floor. It's all decided in the back rooms between the coalition partners according to sort of arcane principles of program quid pro quos, and nothing to do with what actually will affect people on the ground, or very little with it. So
Go on.
and there's there are lots of other places that we can reintroduce random selection to get over this hesitation we have, and I think is one of the reasons that sortition became disassociated with the word democracy in the last 200 years, was this belief that we have to be rational about everything, that everything, if you leave something to chance, you are somehow being weak, whereas sometimes chance is the most powerful tool in the box.
Well, it's your father, of all the things I've ever read on sortition, there are a couple of things. It's the most Socratic book on sortition, and it goes straight at, as you were saying earlier, it goes straight at experts. It basically says experts are just not going to be any good at dealing with new things. And he's not a Michael Gove criticizer of experts, although I generally have more sympathy than, I try to read what people say in the spirit that they were offering it in, rather than as a gotcha. And in that sense, I can also even sympathise with Michael Gove saying we've had enough of experts, because I think we saw a bit of that during COVID. Not that there weren't utterly crazy people saying utterly crazy things, but an awful lot of what the experts said was baloney as well. And so everyone was performing. Let's talk a little bit about how we get there, because let's talk about how your father talks about how you get, if not to utopia, if not to his utopia, how do you get to a system which has much more recognition of the value of sortition? Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. I don't think you want to go on his utopian route, because his utopia starts with a scenario that he wipes out the entire global population except for
I thought that
Antarctic
was a little. Yeah, I thought worthy of a high ideologue. Really, he's obviously got ambitions of sorts.
Yeah, and they survive and he shows how the sortition gradually introduces itself among a group of scientists at this Antarctic station, and how they overcome the very life or death problems that they face through discussion on the. It's mostly about deliberation, because they are all part of the assembly to start with. But it's a fascinating story, and they repopulate the world from New Zealand of all places. But anyway, the way he has about 12 entrance points, I think, in his final chapter, where he gets a bit more realistic about how things should be. He thinks that, for instance, on television might be a place where you would see randomly selected panels discussing things. And That hasn't happened the way he imagined it. I think that
No.
television to entertain more. But interestingly, there's been a recent program in Britain, I think masterminded by Alistair Campbell, the former Labour Party communications director under Tony Blair,
Yep.
in which 12 randomly selected people are instructed in how to become a prime minister. And Alistair Campbell was on his podcast, said he was really struck by how sensible these 12 ordinary people were. And this is, Alistair Campbell can't be the easiest person to get along with. So this is, I think, high praise. He said, my father suggests in his book that you might use.
Well, hang on. Let me just interrupt you there, because maybe after this talk, if you're interested, I actually designed a TV program around this idea, because the thing that your father doesn't face is that if you just say to a TV station, broadcast our citizen jury, they're not interested in that, because if you look at the sort of the values of reality TV, for instance, they're constantly hyping things up. They're desperate to keep people entertained, and there are boring spots. I do think, but I think you can, I think you can restructure a TV show. In fact, look, I'll just sketch it out for you. So take a program like, I think it's called Q&A in Australia, and it's called Question Time in the UK, which is typical thing. It's a studio audience and talking heads. So you throw away the talking heads, you put a question in to the plenary, and then you make sure that they're representative people. You use some sort of mechanism of sampling to make sure that they're a representative sample. You stick them in the Big Brother house for a week, and you make a 1 hour program out of this. You make a 1 hour program, and the focus is who, again, so I'm not so ignorant about it. It turns out I did have the idea of change of mind in my head. I've now articulated it, I've brought it out more. But the focus of the program is on who changes their mind, how they change their mind, why they changed their mind, who helped them change their mind. So it's a personally involving, and one hopes intellectually involving program. One could connect this up with politics as practiced at the moment, because, for instance, let's say there was an election on, you might have a series of these panels, and the spokespeople for the different parties on, say, health or education or defence might come and give their opening pitches. People might give their opening responses, and then this would happen again at the end of the process. And you would ask for, say, an afternoon with these people, and you would film it all. You'd edit it quite heavily, but what you're doing is you're making the focus of our democracy the people's deliberation, not the performance of the talking heads. So I think that, anyway, that's my sketch of how, if you're a television producer, you might be able to produce a program which people would watch, very important for television producers, that people would watch. And it seems to me, if you did this during an election particularly, it could actually become very influential. When political TV is at its apogee, the programs tend to come and go, but when they're at their most influential, they'll often define the week in politics. And so my kind of aspiration for this program would be that it would be everyone would tune into it on a Monday night, is when we all used to, well, not me, but some of the people used to tune into Q&A. I don't know when Question Time is. I think it's on a Thursday, isn't it, in the UK? I don't know.
I don't know.
You see, I'm just terrified. What if people change channel, listen to a different podcast?
Yeah, that's the thing, is I think that if people feel they're being preached at on television, they may not react very well. But
yeah. Well, the idea is that they're not preached at, that this plays to their it honours them. We've really talked for a long time, and I might just introduce a kind of conclude. I'm going to go back to what I said struck me when I mentioned the Chesterton quote and the jolly hostess. I've forgotten the hostess was jolly, but I remember the hostess. And this is your father. This is after he has sketched out the ways in which one might observe selection by lot starting to gather popularity and be applied elsewhere. The essential case for sortition as it was for extended franchise in John Stuart Mill's day, is that democracy liberates. The less that people feel belittled, and the more they feel they belong to society, the greater will be their zest for life, the more fruitful the energy they will display. All one can predict is that once the democratic element in a mixed constitution is seen to work well, there will be pressure to extend it to bring it into the legislative, executive and financial arms of government.